Yeah, let's bring him on right now. Very, very lucky, very happy, and welcoming from Vice News. He's been covering the Vince McMahon story along with lots of other stuff over on Vice. We're welcoming now Tim Marchman. Good morning.
Morning. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Jeremy, go ahead.
Thanks for joining us, and we appreciate it. Let's kind of, we're gonna jump around a little bit, but let's start with what your outlet and you specifically reported. Geez, it was Thursday at this point. It seems like everything is blown up, just with different stuff coming out. But John Laurinaitis coming out and claiming he is a victim, denying the allegations against him, and then claiming that he was part of being a victim of this. Was that expected? Like, what did you think when you heard this from Laurinaitis' attorney?
I was quite surprised. As I said in the article, I wasn't actually reaching out to his lawyer for anything other than to confirm that he was representing Laurinaitis, because to that point, I hadn't been able to nail down who the counsel for any of the parties on that side of this dispute were. So I had some information suggesting who was representing Vince McMahon, who was representing TKO on the corporate side, and who was representing Laurinaitis. So just wanted to reach out to them to establish some lines of communication. We expect to be doing ongoing reporting here. And so obviously that's a very important thing to do, is make sure you know who the lawyer is for somebody who has claims like this made against them. And reached out, and he just confirmed that. And then he said that as an aside, his client was a victim here too. So obviously we got that news out because it seemed very newsworthy, but as someone who's just been following this and as a follower of wrestling and understands, the power Laurinaitis has had for most of the past 20 plus years as head of talent relations, like the significance of it really struck me pretty immediately.
You mentioned, pro wrestling, and let's talk about pro wrestling media for a minute, because I think that there's a role to be played with the pro wrestling media compared to outlets like Wall Street Journal, Deadline, or Vice News. Do you think there's a role or an added benefit of pro wrestling media's coverage in a story like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, God, that's a complicated question, but it's a good question. So I think, and this is me just kind of putting my pundit hat on a little bit, but I would tend to think that a lot of significant news in a story like this is going to break from outlets like the Wall Street Journal. And that's not because they're real reporters or anything like that. I have a sports background, so I really bristle at any idea like that. It's just a matter of connections and experience in certain kinds of stories. For instance, I don't want to make any guesses, because those tend to turn out wrong, about like what the journal's sourcing is on some of the stories they've been breaking. But obviously, being the Wall Street Journal, they're probably gonna have some longstanding connections with the Department of Justice or the FBI. That's not to say that the news about the sex trafficking investigation even came from that direction, but they're gonna have the relationships where if they hear something about that, they'll be more easily able to look into it, to confirm it. Other outlets are also going to have people with backgrounds in legal reporting, people experienced in talking to survivors of sexual violence, different things like that. So there are elements where reporters who have a lot of experience with a type of story are probably going to be able to move the ball ahead. But the wrestling media knows this and is, I think, in a position to make a lot of sense out of what's going on. Obviously, some members of the wrestling media are goofballs who go to, no offense to anyone, but go to press conferences, and when there's a hugely significant sex trafficking story, you're going to ask Paul Levesque, like, how awesome is it to be so awesome as you are? And so that's part of the wrestling media. But there are also a lot of people who really are interested in asking hard questions and just have command of a vast amount of information. One of the things that really strikes me about this story that's a little bit unique is that wrestling has not only people who've been covering it for a long time, who know a lot about the kind of underworld of this business and can tell the difference between real and fake, and with the ways in which the fake can be very real, and all that sort of hall of mirrors stuff that you get with pro wrestling, but also just know a lot of things that are probably taken for granted by a lot of wrestling fans. Like, there are so many podcasts and interviews where wrestlers or former wrestlers or people in the wrestling industry talk pretty openly about, what look like serious criminal allegations. And that's going to be a very difficult thing for anyone coming to this cold to even be able to get context for, to be able to get their heads around. Whereas people who've been covering wrestling, who are familiar with all this, are, just going to have some familiarity with that, or even with rumors that they've heard over the years, and being able to piece those together and say, like, here is something that's come up over the years, or here is something that really, seems to bear on a pattern of how women have been treated in WWE over the years, and the sort of, this seems like something where, it might be worth revisiting, or it seems like the sort of thing where maybe there are police reports or affidavits or different things attached to it, so we can get more verification for this information and start looking into it more. I think that could be really significant. Is that too vague? Is that too vague an answer? I can go in another direction with that if you were getting at something else.
No, I wasn't, because this is something that's been ongoing with other conversations in the sphere, and I'll ask you about something else in a minute. But this was like, this was where does pro wrestling media fit into this? And I think you've covered it pretty well, because wrestling is a weird world, as you know, as a fan and as someone who's covering it now, and it is trying to find those nuances and trying to find where the reality is in a world where there's a lot of distorted reality.
Yeah, it's that, and also it's kind of helpful in a lot of ways that there is so much out there, because one of the tricks with reporting a story like this is not just, the kind of mundane stuff I was talking about earlier, like, do you have sources in this or that part of the government who might be able to help you out with a sort of thing, but you're dealing with very serious criminal allegations, and so you have to be very careful, because it's you don't want to end up defaming anybody or anything like that. If if your reporter doesn't have a background with that, it's understandable that you'd be very cautious. But at the same time, you have this wealth of information that's already out there, and sometimes something like this, a lot of it is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Like, a lot of the pieces are already on the table, I tend to think.
What's your temperature as far as where this case goes? Because it was reported on Friday morning that it's now a federal thing. Vince is under federal investigation. I don't know if you've heard Ann Callis, Janelle Grant's lawyer, say she's been kind of overwhelmed and swarmed with people who are willing to come forward. By what I'm feeling, based on what Ann Callis is saying, doesn't sound like there's any willingness to settle, but we also know how that thing goes as the process moves along, and then the scrutiny comes and the money potentially gets upped. But now that it's, a federal case, what's your temperature on sort of where this case goes?
Well, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future, but I'd tease that apart into two things. So on the criminal side, this is, obviously exceptionally serious for WWE, because sex trafficking is, at the federal level, it's a crime involving commercial sex acts and forced fraud or coercion. It's a 3-part test. I am not a lawyer, but what's in the complaint that Ms. Grant filed certainly seems to pass the test for triggering an investigation. We know from the journals reporting there is a sex trafficking investigation. So that's really problematic for WWE, because at that point, there's been reporting that they took Vince McMahon's phone, they imaged it, so they have access to all his communication. There's a grand jury. Prosecutors can go any direction they want from there. They can go as far back into the past as they want. They have extraordinary latitude to get into other crimes. So, an investigation here wouldn't just be about Grant. It would be about wherever that leads to, really. if this, they're looking at the other NDAs. I think that's really bad for WWE. I think, there's been an ongoing investigation of some sort dating back to 2022. And there's so many aspects to the behavior alleged in the complaint from a criminal perspective. I would have to imagine, if there hasn't been an SEC investigation, there's at least a possibility of an SEC investigation to, things we've reported on a bit and that are known, involving where the money came from, the fact that McMahon didn't let WWE's lawyers in on these NDAs. They were drafted by his own lawyers. There was a revised earnings statement issued due to that. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I would have to think there's at least some potential for investigation there. And then if you start going back years, there are all the things we know about, like the, you're talking about serious felonies that don't have statutes of limitations on them in some cases. So you're absolutely looking at the possibility that, for instance, if prosecutors wanted to go back 30 years and look at the Ring Boy scandal, like, they could do that. So that's all on the criminal side. It's basically, it lays open, everything about how WWE has conducted business, how Vince McMahon has treated people. And, I mean, that can just go. That could be years. They could file some charges tomorrow. It's really difficult to say. On the civil side, I don't know, but I certainly I'm also under the impression that Ann Callis is hearing from a lot of people, and there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. Not all of it, this egregious necessarily. I think everyone who's aware of, kind of behind the scenes stuff in WWE is aware that there's a long history of allegations of, harassment, a discriminatory work environment, just a bad place to be. Are there people who maybe, weren't involved with anything like the allegations made in the suit, but who still might have, a case for lost earnings due to, harassment or turning down advances? Like, maybe. Are there people who signed NDAs and now find that those NDAs are not valid and they want to revisit claims? That's certainly possible. I mean, we really have no idea. And one thing that really, there are a few things that strike me about all this, but I'll just throw out a couple. One is in the complaint. This hasn't gotten a lot of notice, but one of the 4 corporate officers is actually mentioned in the complaint. I don't have it in front of me, so I want to be clear. I'm just going off my recollection of it, but I believe that it's cited as upon information and belief, which is just a lawyer's way of saying we know this, but we're not going to say how we know it right now. One of the officers left the company under circumstances having to do with not wanting to be involved with having grants on the payroll. So, like, is there a corporate officer out there who was fired over this in some way? That seems to be kind of intimated in the complaint. So you have things like that out there. You also have there's been so much talk about the NDAs that were signed, but there's also the possibility that there were lots of people who were subjected to inappropriate conduct or possible serious very grave misconduct who didn't sign NDAs. So there's just a nest there before even starting to get into whether, what shareholders think about the way all this was handled and the way McMahon was brought back in, even though higher ups would have been familiar with the fact that he was a ticking time bomb. They even put it in SEC disclosures. So yeah, I think it's really very early in the process of all this playing out, because you're going to have Callis and you're going to have other lawyers identifying people with claims. And I don't think anyone really has a good guess how many of those there are. And you're going to have a federal investigation that, even just from what we know, has at least good reason to be investigating. And, they have access to Vince McMahon's phone, and we've seen what he allegedly puts in his text messages. So if that is a pattern of him documenting this behavior that explicitly, then, gosh.
You emphatically put down the mug. That's I wasn't sure if you were about to follow up with something there.
No. I'm just kind of trailing off into it. Yeah, it's. I mean, this is painfully obvious, but this is really big, and there's a lot of there's a lot of potential exposure here, I think, for a lot of people.
You mentioned the WWE press conferences and the questions that could ask there. Was there ever a time, especially given the Royal Rumble press conference that just happened, or the WrestleMania kickoff one that they're doing in Vegas this Thursday, was there ever advice about sending somebody to ask a question like that? Because I know it's typically not where y'all would be.
No. No, I mean, we just wouldn't prioritize that. Partly because, you go and maybe you get one question and maybe you do or don't get it answered. I mean, I think the questions I have for WWE are mainly ones we'd probably put to their spokesperson, and that they'd want some sort of legal counsel to review. Obviously, if they would, put me in touch for a half-hour interview with Paul Levesque, or even ask him one question, I'd love to do that, and I'm sure we'll come to a point in the process where we'll want to do that, and we'll put in a request for that. But no, just going to ask one question at a press conference, that would be a pretty expensive question.
Valid. I ask because there are a lot of people who make references to that and say, why aren't there people like this in the room? And that's a great answer. It's good perspective. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to, step on a potential question, but there are going to be a lot of people at this press conference on Thursday. Apparently there will be an opportunity to ask Triple H a question. What question would you ask him, or do you think should be asked if media are going to be there and they view this as an opportunity of like, hey, we don't get a whole lot of time with Triple H. This is a chance, much like the Royal Rumble press conference. This is something that should be asked. We should not just be ignoring this.
There are a lot of questions that I can think of that could be asked. So as a tactical thing, despite his performance in the press, much scrutinized press conference last week, there's a highly savvy, media trained man who's been speaking extemporaneously on live television for decades. So if you're asking a question, I think it's probably a good idea to ask a yes or no question rather than one that can be pretty easily derailed into a statement about how great things are. And you also don't want to ask something that can be brushed away with I can't comment on that because he's a corporate officer of a defendant in a lawsuit, and he has every reason not to say anything. I mean, I wouldn't say anything. I've been, I've been an editor of stories where we've had people send us legal demand letters or have even filed lawsuit. Not here at Vice, but in the past. And the first, no matter how nonsensical the suit is, the first advice you get from your lawyer is don't talk about this, don't tweet about this, don't put anything in writing about this. If you have something to say, you should talk about it, ideally in person. And the reason for that isn't anything sketchy. It's that in the discovery process, anything you say about it can be brought in. It can be brought in as evidence. It can be misconstrued. It can take it out of context. It's wisest just to say nothing about it, and certainly nothing in public and not in front of a potential audience of millions of people. So the first question that comes to mind for me is actually just, would WWE be willing to release anyone who's signed to an NDA or confidentiality agreement from the terms of that? And if not, why not? That's a step that Julie Roginski from Lift Our Voices mentioned to me when I talked to her the other day. That's an organization that focuses on NDAs and other legal issues that tend to that have to do with toxic workplace environments. So there's no real reason he couldn't answer that question. And if WWE has nothing to hide in any of those confidentiality agreements, it should be willing to let them out. He might not be the person who would ultimately make that decision. I don't think the chief creative officer would. I think that would be, probably Nick Khan or something, but it's something he can speak on. And if the answer to that isn't yes, that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that would be interesting information to know. I think another kind of similar question might be, and it's not something I would necessarily think he'd know about off the top of his head, but in Connecticut right now, there is proposed legislation that would bar many types of non-disclosure agreements in the workplace. They're not all bad. Even people who are strong advocates for survivors and consider these very bad instruments generally will allow, if you work for Tesla, you shouldn't be able to quit and then the next day take the Tesla battery design over to Apple, right? Like that sort of thing shouldn't be there. But NDAs that are covering up claims of sexual abuse and harassment and things like that. There's more and more legislation being offered at the state level. That would regulate those, in some case ban those. There is proposed legislation like that in Connecticut. So I would be curious if Levesque, supports that legislation. Should these be banned? The legislation in Connecticut would potentially, by the way, invalidate NDAs retroactively. Like there is the potential for that to come in. So it's very much an ongoing issue. He's the corporate officer of a company that is a big player in Connecticut, and I'd just be interested in seeing what he had to say about that.
A little lighter fare. You mentioned Tesla. How ugly is the Cybertruck?
Oh my God. I've seen a million dystopian movies, read a million dystopian comic books, and fantasized about what I would ride around in the after times many times, and it never looked like that. Good grief. I
saw I saw your work on the Cybertruck and the ongoing conversation there. I had to ask you.
My last one, switching back quickly to the WWE stuff, is just the resources dedicated to this lawsuit from particularly Vice, because I know David Bixenspan has done work with Vice, and you guys, I know it's Vice TV, but it's, they do Dark Side of the Ring and everything. Like how much resource is going into continuing to cover this to make sure like it really doesn't go away? Because we were talking before you came on air, like, everybody is up in arms about the WrestleMania main event, and people are like, oh, well, we're losing sight of the real issue here. And I think a lot of people are worried that that's going to happen.
Oh, no. I mean, I'm not going to talk about what specifically we're doing behind the scenes, but we're very committed to this. The Wall Street Journal is clearly very committed to this. And just to give, I don't want to insult anybody, but I do know that wrestling fans can tend to be a little bit in the wrestling bubble. And
yeah, they suck. We insult them all the time. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, the perspective can get a little distorted. This is the chairman of the board until last week of a $20 billion company in business with Ari Emanuel and Endeavor, someone who's been a globally famous celebrity for decades, is the subject of an FBI sex trafficking investigation. Wrestling booking decisions have absolutely nothing to do with how the story is going to play out. How much attention is going to be paid to it, it's way beyond that point. The idea that the idea that Dwayne Johnson going into the WrestleMania main event, winning the WrestleMania main event, going in the ring and doing some sort of scathing promo about Paul Levesque's career of backstage maneuvering or anything like that is so far removed from the reality of what's going on here. I mean, this is just a very big, very complicated, very lurid story I don't see any way it doesn't get significantly messier. Here I will again throw out this is just an observation you can draw from the complaint. Two observations you can draw from the complaint. One is Vince McMahon was 75 at the time this behavior is alleged, like in his mid 70s, getting into his late 70s, because it covered a few years. Obviously, you don't start doing the sorts of things he's alleged to have done here in your 70s. So, you know, unless this is whole cloth fabrication, which there's absolutely no reason to think it is, you know, there is substantial reason at least to believe that there's a pattern of this behavior. Part of the pattern of behavior is that he, in at least one instance we're aware of, thought it was appropriate as part of contract negotiations to offer a woman to someone he was negotiating with, right? Like that is what is alleged in the complaint, is that he wanted to throw in a human being, Janelle Grant, as a sweetener to the former UFC champion with whom he was negotiating, who, you know, is pretty much confirmed to be Brock Lesnar. There's no one else it could be. So one of the natural questions that arises out of that is, was this a pattern in his negotiating over the years? You know, offering women who were being paid by WWE to talent, to, you know, whoever he was negotiating with. That's a, you know, it might well be this is a one-off. I'm not getting ahead of myself, but it's a reasonable question to ask. Sure, it's a reasonable question to ask. And I think if you follow that up, then, you know, you're looking at a wide universe of really well-known people with whom he's done like high-level negotiations over the years, right? So I just put that out there, not to like darkly hint at anything, but just to stress like the scope of this. This could involve like a lot of people. This could involve a lot of really well-known people, both between the inherently very serious nature of the crimes alleged here and the fact that there are, you know, very well-known people, very well-known, very powerful people who have been in, you know, the upper orbit of WWE and have done business with Vince McMahon over the years. It's just not something it's not something that anyone's going to drop. Like in a story like this, it can stretch on years. And if you look at things like the Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein stories, which I think are appropriate comparisons, and I can unpack that a little bit if you want to, those go on for a long time. You're talking about civil trials, you're talking about criminal trials, you're talking about people coming forward to the press, you're talking about the press digging up old allegations and getting new information about them. Like, you know, does that mean that every day from here to the end of time is going to be dominated by new revelations about Vince McMahon and how he does business and WWE and who knew what when? And no, it doesn't mean that. I mean, you could go weeks, you could go months, and then something new could come out. So I think any idea that, you know, WWE is going to be able to Jedi mind trick their way out of this is just, I mean, it's just not looking at reality. Like there's no way. Even if, you know, even if the Grant lawsuit was settled, you'd still have who knows how many people with claims, probably ranging from the pretty frivolous to the extremely serious, who would be motivated. You have other lawyers out there who would be motivated to take cases on contingency. And you have the federal government there, which, you know, has a lot to look into, and it has all the resources in the world to do it. That's one very obvious thing, by the way, I want to just point out, because I know a lot of people, you know, they don't necessarily pay attention to these distinctions, and that's fine. But when you're looking at a local law enforcement agency, they're going to have fairly limited resources, even a really big one, unless you're talking about like the NYPD, just in terms of time. Like if you're looking at, you know, because I do this in the course of my reporting, you talk to, say, a sheriff in suburban Kansas City about an ongoing investigation they have, and they will say very straightforwardly, right? Like, or, you know, you talk to a prosecutor, they'll say like, I have 3 full-time investigators and I have a travel budget of X, and I have to, you know, I have murder cases, I have all these things I have to look into. I have to be very sparing about where I put my resources. Like I have a lead that the murderer was seen in, you know, North Dakota. Do I send someone out there to look into that? That costs, you know, 5% of my annual budget. What are the odds I'm going to get something out of that? This case is not like that at all. The federal government, for the purposes of this investigation, has functionally unlimited resources. They can send as many people to go talk to as many people as they want. It's not really an issue. They can, if they want, they can sit a couple of people down and tell them to read the entire back catalog of the Wrestling Observer and pull out everything that they think bears looking into. I doubt they're actually doing that, but like they can. This, would be a very complicated process if there's actually a prosecution brought. I'm sure there would be a very vigorous defense, but it's, it's not like a TV show where there's like one dogged investigator trying to pull it all together by himself. I mean, this is a big deal.
Sorry, I had myself muted for a second. Tim, I do want to thank you for your time this morning. You've been very generous with us. I want to give you a chance just to plug what you're working on and what's coming up with Vice.
What I'm working on, I can't really talk about it, but it's all very exciting. So continue to check the site out.
We're trying to get our scoops here now.
Yeah, I will say, like, we're definitely continuing to look into this. I know, competitors of ours are definitely continuing to look into this. I know the wrestling media is going to continue to look into this, and I know, I've heard a lot of different things from different people since we started publishing a couple of stories about this, all of it very helpful, but fans have been very helpful. I've been getting like emails and direct messages from people who are just like, hey, I don't know if you know about this story, but like, this happened 8 years ago. And I always thought it was kind of weird. So maybe you want to look into it. Like, and I would encourage everybody, who's listening to this, just a fan, is like, if you see a reporter whose work you like, or someone who's covering this and they seem legit, by all means, reach out to them. There are people, it doesn't have to be me. There are people, plenty of outlets who are covering this stuff, and I'm sure they want to know about that. It's really helpful to know, because no one's brain can keep all this stuff, in there at one time. It's just too much. So it's great to be hearing about all that stuff, and I think there's a lot there that is worth discussing and examining, and it's a big mess, and my hope is just that people find justice, no matter what that be, and that goes for everyone. That goes for survivors of misconduct. That goes for the accused. I don't want anybody who's been falsely accused to be not to be vindicated. Let's just get the truth out and see where the chips fall.
Tim, we appreciate you joining us today. Again, thank you for your time. Very gracious with your time. I know you said you thought you might and just like can't talk about that, but I don't know if you can see our chat, but a lot of great comments of an informative conversation to have. So I appreciate you again joining us and discussing this and keeping fans up to date on this.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
I'm sorry you listen to Sean Ross Sapp on your runs as well.
Yeah, it's his fault. No, it's fan of Fightful. So thanks very much for having me, and let me know if I can do anything for you.
Thank you,
Tim.
so much.
I'm sure we'll be in contact. We appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, take care.